All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Limit Breakers. This is our third official episode, including our introduction. And today, we're talking about something particularly close to our hearts. So close, in fact, that it's our namesake Final Fantasy VII. The Limit Breakers, of course, for those who are keen enough to realize, is a name taken from the battle system of Final Fantasy VII. Now, Final Fantasy VII, as many of you already might know, was released in 1997 around the world and has remained a staple in the history of RPGs ever since. Today, whether you love it, you hate it, or somewhere in between, I think you're going to find much of interest.
Bum 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 ba ba. I've been waiting to do that for a while, guys. Sorry, just had to start that way. Welcome back, guys, to the Limit Breakers. Steve just gave you a pretty awesome introduction to what I'm really excited about doing today. It's talking about a game that is no surprise, is really near and dear to my heart, near and dear to these guys' hearts. First of all, how's it going, guys?
I'm good. How's it going?
Fantastic. We're ready to get right to it.
We can't really thank you guys enough for what you've already the feedback you've given us, the listens, everything else. I know I was already excited about doing more just based on the responses we've gotten, but I'm even more excited because this is an important game to all of us. Not that MMOs weren't. I actually think, we kind of bared our souls in that episode in certain regards in a way that made it pretty fun to do, but this is a big one for all of us, and I'm really excited to get into it. So before we dive right into Final Fantasy VII, a true masterpiece, if I will, just like we did last time, I want to talk a little bit about games we've been playing, news we've kind of caught on to. I know it's kind of a fun way just to sort of see where you guys have been the last week because, contrary to popular belief, we don't spend all week previous gaming and chatting with each other. So what have you guys been playing? Same stuff, different stuff?
I'm still playing Red Dead Redemption. However, I would like to say that after this episode ends, I am going to be playing Off-World Trading Company, which is a game that some of my friends that I went to college with were working on, and I suggest you guys download it. It's from the makers of Civ 4, and if you like RTSs and some strategy, I recommend checking it out.
So Justin has ties of the bigwigs in the gaming industry. He might be leaving us behind pretty soon to, I don't know, vault right up the ladder somewhere. But no, that sounds awesome. I'd like to check that out and like to talk more about that in another episode. Steve, you been playing new stuff or catching any news you're interested in? Or
Yeah, so still playing that game, Idle Crusade, I mentioned. A lot of fun. I also still pick up Final Fantasy Tactics from time to time on my iPhone, which has created quite a unique experience, to be honest.
Yeah, that's I think of all the games I've ever played, if that isn't number one in terms of just most replayability, it's damn near the top of the list. So it's no surprise that you're still enjoying that because I know I could play that infinite number of times and still enjoy it.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's made me somewhat excited about just the prospect of a lot of the classics being released on the 3DS because, I mean, I think it really does change the experience of playing these classics when you can take them with you. And, I think we've all had the experience perhaps of just thinking about wanting to play a game when you're out doing errands, perhaps.
Oh, no, that's actually a perfect point. I wanted to reference the same thing. For people that are 3DS owners or maybe aren't 3DS owners but are considering it, they recently released a bunch of SNES titles in their virtual console library, and it's a lot of games that I've either played and want to play again or hadn't played and was looking for a good way to access them. Games such as Earthbound, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, really, really, really awesome games that are now available for the 3DS. Please, if you're interested in all, check these out. All great games. It's incredibly cool, as Steve mentioned, to have the ability to take these on the go with you, to play them in a manner that, in all honesty, just given the nature of their graphics, really works well on the 3DS. So I downloaded all of them. I actually bought a Nintendo eShop gift card and literally bought every single one day one.
As Cam is wont to do.
Yes, indeed. Also, the big news, I think, in gaming this past week that I did want to reference was the news that the Zelda for Wii U is now being pushed back to 2017 to coincide with the launch of the new Nintendo console. And I know that we're all Zelda guys here, and I guess that's sort of a double-edged sword of it's kind of cool that they're going to have more time to develop it and it's going to be a next-gen game, but also kind of a bummer that once again it's being pushed back even further. So I know Steve and I had a lot of fond memories with Zelda growing up. I don't know if you were interested in getting the new one when it came out or not, but did you catch that news this week?
I did actually, and I think my take on it is perhaps more positive than most of the people that are crying, but I've had such a great experience with Zelda games just over time, and so I usually do have confidence that Nintendo is making this decision for the right reason, even if they make this decision a little bit too often.
Yes, I think that's actually a perfect way to put it. As far as what I'm playing myself, still the same games, but I feel like that's pretty fitting because one of the 2 games I'm playing that I'm actually really close to the end of is the PS4 re-release of Final Fantasy VII. So I did not do that in hopes to coincide with this podcast, but I'm very glad that I am because it's going to help me a lot in having a very fresh perspective on the game. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything, I wanted to give 2 little disclaimers right now just to get them out of the way. The first is that we will be a spoilery podcast going forward. I don't think we're going to make an effort to go out of our way to ruin any gaming experiences for anybody, but it is kind of essential to talk about some of the spoiler aspects of these games when we're discussing them. So if perchance you haven't played the games we're talking about and you don't want to know some of the things that happen in them, please play them before you listen to the podcast. We don't want to be the ones that ruin these awesome experiences for you. I know anyone who's played Final Fantasy VII can probably think of a couple instances that would be ruined quite horrifically if you heard them for the first time on here. Secondly, I've tagged both of our existing episodes as explicit on iTunes. They have sort of a relatively borderline policy about what explicit means exactly, and I don't think any of us intend to make this podcast overly profanity-laced or overly mature, but we are all guys in our 20s. We want to talk relatively frankly about games. I don't think you're going to come into having an issue with us in terms of it being really too much for most people to handle, but at the same time, know that we might drop a word here or there every now and then, or talk about some things that might be a little bit inappropriate for younger kids. So just be aware of that. The explicit isn't meant to imply that we're going to have like crazy TV MA rated episodes, but at the same time, we are going to talk frankly. So with all that out of the way, guys, are you ready to tackle FF7?
Let's have at it.
Am I ever?
Well, I think there's no better way to start off then than maybe talking about how we first heard about Final Fantasy VII, where you first were when it struck you, your experiences the first time you checked it out. I know there's a lot of overlap in these experiences because we had some very fun memories experiencing the game together when we were young, but do you guys have relatively vivid memories of the first time you saw it, heard about it, or were aware of it at all?
Oh, exceedingly. I mean, so I was about 6 years old actually when I first encountered Final Fantasy VII, and it was over a neighbor's house who will remain nameless actually, but it was a really funny contrast because this particular home was always extremely dirty, and I walk in and juxtaposed to this environment which offended the senses in many ways was frankly it was Neo Bahamut actually scorching the crap out of I forget which specific opponents it was, but I remember from the moment I saw that dragon, I was absolutely hooked. It was, I stayed there and I watched my friend play for probably 2 hours or something, and it was my first real foray into both a fantasy world and into an RPG, and just seeing Chocoboos and Bahamuts and Cloud Sword all in like the same 2-hour experience is insane.
Quick disclaimer before you talk, Justin. We're probably going to use the term Chocoboos a lot. I know the vast majority of people don't call them that, but even if you literally beat me over the head with a bat over the fact that it's Chocobos, I'm always going to call them Chocoboos. So,
agreed.
Yeah, very sorry going forward for anyone who gets offended by us maybe intentionally mispronouncing that name, but that's the way we said it growing up, and I think that's going to stick probably forever. So, moving on, Justin.
I think for me, and probably for all of us at this table, one of my earliest experiences and probably my first experience with Final Fantasy VII was coming over here to Cam's house on a Sunday afternoon back when I was probably like 10 years old, walking up to his room, just seeing a freshly rented PlayStation from Blockbuster, and Final Fantasy VII on the screen. I believe it was the scene in Midgar when Cloud is facing the Turks, and every single character on the screen got trined, and they all had pyramids around them, and we could not figure out for the life of us how to destroy them. And then at that point, because none of us really understood the concept of a memory card at that point, or we're going to bother to purchase one for a weekend system rental, we wound up having to spend several hours getting back to that point, and I think it was very traumatic for everybody involved, and kind of changed for me what I thought went into playing a game.
For future reference, for those who have not yet beaten that battle, you can in fact attack the pyramids to make them disappear. We were not bright enough to realize that at the time.
Yeah, and as not to offend the enemy skill knowledge of many people, it wasn't Trine, it was just Pyramid. Trine is later in the game, and it's very rude you would even say that.
That's
but
true. Such a noob.
No, that was an incredibly memorable moment for all of us. I can still vividly remember seeing television advertisements at the time for Final Fantasy VII, and I don't even think I necessarily knew when I first saw them, within the first couple seconds of the ad starting, if it was an ad for a movie, if it was an ad for a game. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, so it was really sort of exciting but confounding, because I don't even think I necessarily knew how to process what it was. But all I knew was that if I had some means by which to play it or experience it, I wanted to try. So I immediately, I think, went out in the hopes of getting the game before I realized, as a naive 10-year-old kid, that I'd need to actually purchase a PlayStation or get a PlayStation to play it. So as Justin mentioned, got my parents to rent an actual console from Blockbuster, which they used to do, which was like, it wasn't crazy expensive, but it was like $20 or $30 for the weekend, which, is relatively pricey. So I'd rent that and the game, and we'd essentially have just the weekend to try to beat this epic 60 to 80 hour game, which of course didn't work out. But that being my first exposure to it, I was so absolutely blown away, even by just what we got to in those first rentals, that I knew I absolutely had to own the game, and shortly thereafter bought it and started my love affair proper with the game. But yeah, I know an important aspect of it for me was the fact that gaming, to me, previous to Final Fantasy VII, had always been a very casual, very limited thing, where I can remember us all playing games, and I played games myself, obviously, we all did, but gaming back then sort of meant putting in a cartridge, kind of goofing around or playing something for an hour or so, turning it off and sort of moving on and not really thinking much about it in between gaming sessions. I don't know if that was the same for you guys, but Final Fantasy VII was my introduction to gaming as an emotional and narrative experience, where you were invested while you were playing, but in between playing sessions, I actually felt like I'm in the middle of this ongoing story that I want to see what happens next. While I'm not playing it, I'm thinking about what might happen next. I almost didn't think games were capable of that till I played this. I thought games were like, almost an arcade type phenomenon, where you go, you put your quarter in, you play till you're bored, and you're done. But this was like, holy crap, I just played for 5 hours. I want to play another 5 hours. I want to know, it really blew my mind. I didn't even think that was possible.
Oh, I think that's honestly a perfect description and analogy, as like a comparison to like an arcade experience, because that was up till Final Fantasy VII, that was exactly, I'm thinking of like Sonic in particular, exactly the types of games I played were the things where you have very limited goals that could be achieved very easily in one sitting. And in Final Fantasy VII, unfortunately, when I first played it through, I did not appreciate the story as well as I would have liked, but nonetheless, there was this driving force of wanting to get more and more powerful materia, wanting to master it all, wanting to get perfect equipment, and and certainly one playthrough was far inadequate to those ends.
Yeah, I think I would agree with both of those. For me, I think the days of Sega and using passwords and starting with none of the skills or equipment or anything that you had was kind of always put me at a disadvantage. I think actually Final Fantasy VII for me was probably the first game I even found out that strategy guides existed. I don't know if that was the case for you guys, but the idea that something was so complex to even play and put so much time into, that I had to actually read about what I was supposed to do, was just kind of a mind-blowing concept to me.
Well, I think I knew strategy guides existed, but that didn't prevent me from literally printing off 65 pages of game FAQs and bringing down like a giant packet to Cam's house to conquer the entire game.
Which at the time, I think like that ink alone was like $100 investment just to print off like tips and tricks for a single game. I mean, it shows you really had to be hardcore at that time to delve into anything that way.
I'm pretty sure I've never put as much effort into a research project as I did that first Final Fantasy experience.
I can attest to that. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk at least just in passing about the development of the game and the wonderful people responsible for making it possible. The game, as is well established, was made by Square, who published their games under the title Square Soft, but were then and still are now clearly a pretty massive titan in the world of JRPGs and really gaming in general. The game began its development in '94 after Final Fantasy VI wrapped up and was actually intended, as Justin and I talked about earlier, to be released on the SNES. But they eventually decided to push that from the SNES to the N64, and then when they realized the N64 didn't actually have the capacity to hold all the pre-rendered cutscenes, they then severed their exclusive relationship with Nintendo and put it on PlayStation. So inadvertently, my love of PlayStation for a lifetime might have been completely irrevocably damaged or never existed in the first place had Final Fantasy VII actually been published for a Nintendo console like it was intended. It's kind of weird to think about how that one decision kind of shaped my entire gaming preferences going forward. But were you guys aware of that? I kind of knew that in passing, but reading that again was really sort of eye-opening.
I don't know that I was aware of it at the time, but I certainly believe it now, only because in my own experience, I had a Nintendo. I didn't have a PlayStation until much later than you guys. And I actually, the only reason I got a PlayStation, the only reason I wanted a PlayStation when I did finally get it was for Final Fantasy VII. And like everything else I played on Nintendo and loved, but Final Fantasy VII became so essential to my gaming that I literally devoted an entire system to it.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right there, where you'll read a lot of quotes online, essentially claiming that the PlayStation's like claim to fame, and the reason it sold so many units initially was because Final Fantasy VII was attached to that console.
Yeah, I think that it really kind of fits the mold of what has come to be known as a console seller, like a game that in and of itself is probably more responsible for sales of a console than even the advertising of the console itself, which is a funny concept, but it really was true. I mean, in past generations, even Nintendo 64 at the time launching with like Super Mario 64, that was a game that if you owned that console, you had to own that game. You just didn't have it any other way. But one little bullet point before we move on to specific game discussion, it's interesting to me that a lot of the team that was actually working on Final Fantasy VII and developing it was actually either pulling double duty on Chrono Trigger or had actually jumped from one project to the next. So it's almost like the kind of equivalent of like two film crews having worked on The Godfather and Star Wars simultaneously. Like, I can't really think of an example of two more mammoth games kind of being developed simultaneously that have both gone on to be such important parts of gaming culture that actually the same company was working on simultaneously. It's really kind of crazy to think about.
I mean, I think the only conclusion to be drawn is it was a pretty damn special group of people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think the changes, for better or worse, since then, you can kind of attack from different directions, but I don't think anyone really can argue that that wasn't really a golden generation of RPG development, and Square was definitely at the heartbeat of that.
Yeah, I had read online a little while ago about how like Edea from Final Fantasy VIII was actually initially talked about being in Final Fantasy VII. It's just kind of funny taking some of the story ideas that were part of Chrono Trigger or part of Final Fantasy VII or maybe future Final Fantasies, and just thinking what would have happened if had some of those elements been changed up and what the game would look like now.
That's actually correct, and the setting of Final Fantasy VII was originally going to be New York City, as bizarre as that sounds, and that actually got used in Parasite Eve. So they kept a lot of their cool ideas for the development of the game and actually put them in further games. But enough setting up the background of this monumental gaming experience. Let's talk a little bit about, now that we've kind of laid a baseline for where we were when we first saw the game, how we felt when we first saw it. I'm assuming, and actually I'm not assuming really because I do know to a certain extent, but we've all played the game since then. Obviously, we've picked the game back up since 1997. I've picked it up quite a few times. Could you guys estimate roughly maybe how many times you've played through a majority of it or beaten it every time, or are you sort of ambiguous at this point?
I would say that counting like overlaps with copies with Steve played at my house before he actually owned a PlayStation, I played through a majority of the game probably like 3 or 4 times. I mean, but it's so long that, I mean, doing it more than that, I can't imagine how much time I would have spent.
It is funny actually that I think my friendship with you, Justin, during that time period actually consisted of me playing your PlayStation. But yeah, I would estimate in my own case, I've probably have played through it about 5 times. Understanding that the last two playthroughs, especially the last one, were like so OCD about doing everything there was to do, getting everything there was to get, beating every single minigame possible, getting all the master materia, emerald weapon, ruby weapon. You know, I could go on and on, but I would say the number of playthroughs that I did aren't necessarily representative of like the amount of devotion to the game that was there.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question in games this long that a single copy attempting to get everything or do everything in many, many ways can sort of be equivalent to playing another game through 10 times over, because
Exactly.
the experience is such that it just makes sense that way. But yeah, I'm actually pretty similar. It's kind of surprising that, I don't know if this is like a big revelation that will kind of let the cat out of the bag, but Final Fantasy VII is my favorite game of all time. And despite it being my favorite game of all time, I've actually only ever beaten the game twice, and I've only played it through to the Northern Crater part at the end 4 times, one of those times being currently right now. So it's kind of funny that despite my abundant passion for the game and my love for it, in a certain sense, I almost didn't want to revisit it that often, because I wanted my feelings about it to remain as lofty and pure as they had, and I almost didn't want to sully it with like playing it again and having my expectations, or my not expectations, but my feelings about it lowered a bit. But I have found that in playing it again, a lot of my perceptions about it from that wide-eyed awe when I first played it have changed quite a bit now. I don't. From your most recent playthroughs, do you guys have stuff that you feel pretty different about now, or are your opinions still pretty even keel with where they were then?
I mean, yeah, I definitely think my opinions changed a lot over time. I will say what happened to me is I did get very attached to one particular copy, and unfortunately, eventually lost that memory card, which bugs me to no end. But for a period of probably 8 years, I would just load up that copy and just wander around the world and just kick the crap out of enemies and summon different summons that I wanted to see again. And I don't think I ever lost that sense of awe and majesty of the world that you get. But I did become increasingly frustrated with kind of like just the bad translation, what eventually felt like pretty shallow graphics. Yeah, and I guess like a slow pace of battle at a certain point. You know, it's so funny how that perception wasn't there in the beginning, but after you've played through other games and come back, it just feels so slow.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, Final Fantasy VII is definitely like set a benchmark, but I think a big appeal of it for me too was kind of the whole. I talked about it last time in last week's episode, but just kind of like the whole open world experience kind of felt Tolkien-esque, if you will.
It's a good way to put it.
With the like the Cetra and the City of the Ancients, kind of being like these almost like mystical creatures, and then you have like, well, not creatures, they're actual people, but and then you have the whole mythology with the summons and all these like secret places to explore, the whole optional characters that are kind of introduced. It kind of felt like a choose your own adventure book in a way. So having that as my first Final Fantasy experience, I think, and really RPG experience for that matter, I think it's been curious to watch how my interests have kind of changed, and to see the progression of RPGs as a whole, as you're moving forward with particularly the Final Fantasy series, and kind of where they started with 7 and kind of where they've gone since then.
Yeah, I think you both hit the nail on the head, and Steve actually hit multiple nails on the head when it comes to the specific aspects of the game that I do hold in different regard now, that I really enjoy being able to say I still consider the game an absolute benchmark. I still consider it my favorite game of all time, and I still have a really high level of love for it that allows me to really enjoy playing it now. But I can, especially being that I'm playing a current copy, look back at a lot of aspects of it and realize that being 18 years older, having played a litany of games since then, there are a lot of aspects of 7 that aren't as good as they are in other games. It's just simple matter of, in 20 years they've bested the formula in certain ways, and there are things now that are a little bit tedious to deal with. The battles do feel slow unless you speed them up. The graphics, if you're not used to them, especially the character models, really aren't, anything very nice to look at. They're basically just blocks with a little bit of coloration. The PS4 digital re-release does smooth them out because it's actually the PC graphics.
I just can't imagine seeing noses.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. Like it's really weird to think how mind-blowing that looked at the time, but you look back now and you can see how younger kids see it and think, this is awful, because it really is like pretty funny graphical style. The translation was notoriously bad. It made the story, which I think is a really cool story, sort of hard to follow unless you really dug deep into a lot of the hidden stuff in the game and really sort of understood a lot of the kind of circle logic that the game presented. But I think it's a testament to the game that I can look back, acknowledge all those flaws, and still feel like this game is still so awesome, so fun, and so great. I mean, a lot of games you look back now, and despite the fact that you have those nostalgic memories still really finally held in your heart, you can acknowledge that the game, in reality, objectively, really isn't that good. But Final Fantasy VII is one, for me, that despite my opinion changing about it, still does hold up.
I think it's amazing to me, honestly, that I enjoyed the game as much as I did for so long without understanding like so many essential elements of the story, and that's partly due to bad translation, and that's partly due to me being young. But basic questions of distinction between Zack and Cloud, the fact that Sephiroth's actually in the crater the whole time, I could go on, but like I didn't get that, and I still loved it through at least 3 to 4 playthroughs before I did get it.
I was the exact same way. I mean, I think there's so many things going on with, mini games and side quests and leveling up, getting level 99 and trying to perfect the game and get all the items and stuff like that, I mean, I just kind of felt like I didn't really care if I understood the story or not. I just wanted to go around this world, explore it, do all these other crazy things that there were to do.
Which is unfortunate, but is a testament to the game in a very strange way.
And isn't that sort of like a nice and almost beautiful element of all media or art, is the ability to kind of enjoy this particular thing in a very pure way, even without fully grasping it, but then being able to go back later and acknowledge that it actually had a lot of subtext and a lot of subtlety that was completely lost on me as a kid for the most part, but actually makes it fun to revisit now because I realize I did miss a lot, and I didn't really fully, all the analogies of the environmental, political, and societal elements of Shinra, Midgar, and the entire structure there, this whole identity of like the existential and philosophical qualm of Cloud and him dealing with his own psyche, how Sephiroth tied into his own understanding. I mean, all this stuff is like, there's no way at 10 years old I was going to fully appreciate all this, but I still played the game, felt like I sort of knew what was going on, and just loved the hell out of it. So it's like, it's almost like you're getting 2 experiences for the price of 1.
I think that's perfect. I mean, I don't have much to add other than perhaps an analogy there, and that's just, I mean, when it comes to art, let's take writing. People often remark that the best stories are those that you can appreciate in a different way at different stages of your life. So, a common book that people say this about would be like Huck Finn. You can read Huck Finn when you're 10, 15, 20, and have a different experience every time. And I think to some extent that's definitely what happened, at least to me, with Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, I mean, you also have to keep in mind the fact that we were like we said, like 10 years old. So the concept of even like understanding such a complex plot is pretty absurd. Not even like take away the fact that there was like a bad translation to the game. It's just kind of like when you're watching. I mean, I'm sure there's cartoons and things that we watch now that had
right
subtext of like innuendo and things that we didn't pick up on the first time, and then years later we're like, holy crap, I can't believe we actually like didn't realize this. But I mean, it's just kind of an age. The age definitely played a factor in it for me, I think.
Undoubtedly. But I think what I'm getting at is that there are many games that, being that young, being that immature, that we would not have appreciated at all, and we still like thoroughly enjoyed this game. And so I think that in itself is noteworthy.
Do you mean to tell me that you didn't read and analyze every single piece of paper laying in the Shinra Mansion basement?
Not only did I not read it, but I don't remember what the hell it says.
Well, then in a certain sense, I consider your opinion null and void the rest of the episode, but moving on. In my own experience in Final Fantasy fan communities, and Final Fantasy VII fan communities, and just Final Fantasy communities at large, Final Fantasy VII, as is the case with a lot of critically and commercially successful media, has a very kind of split opinion about it. There's people that fervently love it, obviously, because it's a very popular game and a very acclaimed game. But there's also people that really kind of have an issue with it and really push back against its popularity. And it's been hard for me to ever really decipher what portion of that was people that genuinely didn't think it was a good game or thought it was overrated, or people that were just sort of angry that it was held in higher regard than their favorite game. I don't know if you guys have necessarily ever engaged anyone who either didn't like it or thought it was overrated. I have quite a bit, and I have a couple opinions about why that might be, but I don't know. In your guys' own case, have you encountered sort of strong feelings one way or another about the game's legacy now, this much after the fact?
Yeah, I mean, I've encountered a few people, and probably some of the same people that both of us at this table have. But I mean, I can I can understand, some of the frustrations with the game. You have quite a long time investment that you have to put into the game. It's not like your Call of Duty where you can just pick it up, like shoot somebody in the head, win the match and it's over. It requires a lot more time and effort than that. And in addition to that, I mean, there's also the whole, like we talked about earlier, the idea that Final Fantasy up till that point was a Nintendo franchise, and you always have people who are part of like this diehard group of people who are like, I'm only going to buy Nintendo products, I'm only going to play Nintendo games. So some of the fans might have been lost as well when it jumped to a different console. Of course, there's other reasons besides that, which I guess I'll let you guys touch on.
Nintendonians, are you talking about?
Yeah, I think that's what they're called.
Oh, okay. Steve?
Yeah. Everyone I've talked to that's a serious and somewhat thoughtful gamer, all of them recognize Square, all of them recognize the enormous significance of the Final Fantasy series, and all of them recognize the historical significance of Final Fantasy VII. But there definitely are some who can't quite connect with it in the same way, and in many cases can't even finish a playthrough, which is somewhat depressing for me. But I mean, I think understandable. I think especially for the kids that are, at least 6 years younger than us, perhaps, for whom gaming started at a higher point of, at the very least, graphics, and I would say and speed of gameplay. And because of that, it's a hard thing to get beyond to appreciate the rest of the game if that's your starting point.
No, and there's absolutely a huge element of that. It's frustrating to me when I see people discuss the game, and in a very superficial way, the first thing they say is, if you go back now, the graphics just really look like crap. I'm like, if you go back to a lot of things that were in vogue and cutting edge 20 years ago, yeah, they don't hold up now. It's freaking 20 years ago, and in 20 years, technology's changed a ton. But on top of that, I do think there's a fundamental kind of double-pronged element of the backlash against Final Fantasy VII. One is just this sort of pushback against anything that achieves the level of popularity that Final Fantasy VII has. There's always going to be people that just don't enjoy almost anything reaching that level of popularity and feel like if they were to embrace it, they were sort of one of the mindless masses. And it's sort of this weird almost feeling like, oh, the game's held in such high regard, I can't hold it in high regard, or else I'll just be another one of,
I think one way to put it on exactly that note is that, it achieved such a level of popularity that it became mainstream. And I think that there's always types of people, types of personalities that can't quite consent to the idea of really being part of the mainstream.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a perfect point because, Final Fantasy VII really did popularize the JRPG and really RPG genre outside of Japan. So it really was a niche thing to that point. It wasn't like you were going to parties and, over cocktails discussing your latest, RPG. I mean, it was the kind of thing where you really had to seek out if you wanted to get into it. Now all of a sudden you got TV commercials about this game. You got this game selling millions of units. You got people who never, for any reason, knew what previous entries into the Final Fantasy series were playing and loving this game. And it felt a little bit less like a special beloved secret and more of like a big budget movie that everyone went out and saw. And that's always going to ruffle some feathers the wrong way. But also, I do feel like this generation, and it's a generation we're obviously part of, so I feel like we're sort of the perfect people to be talking about this. I feel like this generation is simultaneously overly nostalgic, and now in response to that overly nostalgic mindset, has people that are being unnecessarily harsh to people who are nostalgic. It's sort of a really weird dichotomy where I myself am a very nostalgic person, and I love. Obviously, we're doing a gaming podcast about retro gaming. I love talking about this stuff. I love still thinking about this stuff. I have very fond memories that I like to revisit about lots of things. But I feel like because millennials have gotten such a bad rep, or a bad rap, I mean, for being overly childlike, for being, somewhat irresponsible or too stuck in the past, people have started to come out and almost like go way overboard in bashing all nostalgia. And now, like, if you even so much as mention anything you like previous to a year ago, you're an immature loser who's stuck in the past. And so there's been a lot of that where it's like, move on from this. It's old. But I mean, I don't feel like that's really a good reason.
It's like, I would say it's an attempt to justify gaming through like purely pragmatic terms, and it's an attempt, I think, that ultimately fails. But just, when you treat gaming as purely from the view of entertainment without, I would say, appreciating the more perhaps aesthetic elements that we do become nostalgic about, you really miss what the experience of many gamers actually is.
Oh, absolutely. Justin, you want to?
I think, sorry, Steve said it perfectly. So, yeah, I mean, you have these games that really defined what gaming is, what gaming can be, and if you cut out all those essential parts and just play what's relevant now or what's good now, then you are really losing out on like the essence of games, of art, of history, really, as a whole.
I will say that Final Fantasy VII set itself up for a lot of judgment by having the back cover literally say, quite possibly, the greatest game ever made. So, if you didn't know what the game was and were picking it up for the first time just on a lark at like the game store and you saw that, you're going into it with pretty high expectations. And I think those expectations were met for a lot of people, but I can see how if you're going in thinking, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever created, there's a decent chance, you'd be somewhat let down.
Yeah, I mean, I think to give Final Fantasy its appropriate and accurate due, it's necessary to really keep the historical context in perspective, and to see that it was the greatest game in many ways, in as much as it really set a type of like formula for future Final Fantasies that were fantastic. So I loved, I'm in the very dubious position of being someone who actually liked Final Fantasy VIII even more than Final Fantasy VII, despite loving Final Fantasy VII thoroughly. But I don't think Final Fantasy VIII really did much different than Final Fantasy VII, other than refining many of the essential elements and putting it in a kind of a sci-fi environment that really spoke to me in a particular way. But I think Final Fantasy, there's an argument to be made that Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX are both just refinements of a formula that was really defined in Final Fantasy VII.
And the fact that Steve feels that way is why he and I are no longer as close as we once were. But
that's true. Sacrifices have to be made.
Now, I do think it's an important aspect of explaining the significance of Final Fantasy VII in the history of gaming to acknowledge how powerful it was as both a cinematic-like experience and how powerful the actual cinematics within the game were. I know the trailer alone showed off some of the cutscenes from the game when I first saw it, and like I mentioned earlier, I didn't know if it was a game or not because the games I had seen up to that point, playing Sega-type stuff, weren't even in the same realm as how impressive, how epic, and how just mind-boggling things like the Nibelheim cutscene or the game's opening on the bombing mission were. I didn't know that games could have things like that. I thought that was like, and it makes sense because it was one of the most expensive games ever made. There was a lot of money spent on it, but it was so far and away above anything else I'd experienced in terms of the production value, the level of just the scope of everything, that it made me be able to see games as approximations of films where your emotions are kind of ebbing and flowing the same way you would in a good movie. You're on the edge of your seat for a lot of moments. There's actual surprises that legitimately made me sit back in my seat. It felt like a cinematic experience, so much so that it opened my eyes to the fact that games could be something that you invested yourself in the same way you did with a good movie. I don't know if you guys felt the same, but I know that was, like, without question, a really big key aspect of why it was so popular.
Yeah, I think that's what I was hinting at earlier without becoming too philosophical, perhaps. But it's just that until you really appreciate the sense in which Final Fantasy and many games, but specifically Final Fantasy in this case, can be a type of art. You really are going to miss what makes it such a magical experience for so many people.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, when I first saw some of the cutscenes and cinematography in Final Fantasy VII, I was blown away. I mean, you had the whole G-Bike scene with Cloud escaping Midgar, and it literally reminded me of like the Tom Cruise scene in like Mission Impossible 2, where he's like he's trying to save Tandy Newton.
First time I've ever heard Cloud compared to Tom Cruise.
And it probably never will be again. I'm sorry for making that comparison, but but then you have like those action-packed moments, and then you have perhaps the biggest moment, and I apologize for anybody who hasn't played the game, but the whole scene with Sephiroth like killing Aerith, and it's literally like described by many people as a tear-jerking moment and probably one of the greatest cutscenes in video game history as a whole. And I guess I'll let you guys talk a little bit about that and how that scene made you feel.
Yeah, I would definitely say that scene and the Nibelheim scene that Cam actually just mentioned, perhaps two of the most iconic moments in gaming history.
Yeah, I was actually going to wait till the end of this segment, but maybe now's the perfect time. If you had to choose maybe a favorite moment, whether it be a cutscene or just an actual playable moment in the game that stood out the most in your mind, just looking back right now, you don't think about it too much, but what's the first thing that comes to mind for you guys? For me, and it's kind of cheating because I'm playing it right now, so it kind of like, it's fresh in my mind what stuck out to me the most, but the scene in which you go to the City of the Ancients to find Aerith after she's traveled there, you go to sleep, and then you wake up, and the song called You Can Hear the Cry of the Planet is playing, and it's very strange, foreboding, like alien song. It's really beautiful, but it's very eerie, and you just know that it's building up to something that's going to be monumental. And you follow sort of the path through the City of the Ancients, this very serene, very weird place, and eventually reach the altar where Aerith is killed. And the whole way that scene is done, from waking up all the way through her death, is like the most just perfectly laid out, dramatic, emotional, and cinematic play-by-play in terms of the music's perfect, the fact that you have to do it. There's actually, I can't remember if there's battles or not. I don't think there's even battles leading up to that scene. If there are, then I think I just kind of like zoned them out because I was just so curious what I was walking towards. But that stands out to me still, and I listen to that song all the time just on my own time. And every time I listen to it, I immediately just snap back to that moment of, holy crap, shit's about to go down. Like what's about to happen right now? I don't know if anything stands out to you guys. We've mentioned a couple already, but
I remember a moment that I don't think most people would mention, but what did speak to me actually was relatively early in the game when you first get to Junin, and it's rather tense. There's essentially one of the planet's guardians that's attacking Junin, and you have all of these massive weapons and enormous amounts of soldiers all trying to defend the place, and to me it felt like a Lord of the Rings scale battle of sorts.
Yeah, I think I already touched on a couple of my favorite scenes already. But I think I want to talk a little bit about how the cinematography and the cutscenes from Final Fantasy VII actually kind of resulted in this whole push of, I guess, machinima, and getting a machinima type movie where you have something like Advent Children, where you take the story of Final Fantasy VII and you kind of, people were so like enthralled with the story itself that there was a whole sequel made for it, just outside of the game experience entirely.
Well, yeah, I think it speaks to how cinematic in scope the producing team and directing team of Final Fantasy VII felt the game was, because that immediately segued into the development and release of The Spirits Within, which, regardless of your opinions about that movie, that basically existed because of the success of Final Fantasy VII, because
Right.
Final Fantasy VII succeeded so greatly as a cinematic experience that they felt like this team could probably do a full-on theater release film. And as Justin just mentioned, that continued on into things like Advent Children and beyond. So obviously they considered this story and this experience to be one that lended itself very well to actual movies.
Exactly. It just transitioned so easily, whatever you might think of those end products.
I'd like to pose a question to you guys about that, though. So Final Fantasy VII was kind of one of the first games that had that level of graphical capacity. If it were pushed back even like a couple years later, do you think it would have had the same commercial success, because it was really one of the first big titles that like landed on PlayStation as a whole. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on like if you think that the timing would have definitely changed everything, or if you think it would still hold up.
Well, I think that hypothetical is a difficult one, only because there was a certain cause and effect relationship between Final Fantasy and a lot that happened in gaming immediately after it. So if we take Final Fantasy out of the equation, for those 3 years following when Final Fantasy VII was originally released, what would have happened? I don't really know, and so I'm not sure.
I think that's a great question, and I lean on the side of I do think that it coinciding with the release of PlayStation, or at least relatively soon thereafter, was an essential element of its success, and I don't think it would have quite the same legacy if it came out later, because while there were a lot of people that we don't want to disparage the Final Fantasy series pre-7 whatsoever. There's a lot of people that consider 6 the zenith of the series. All the games in the series previous to that are pretty cool. I mean, I've played all of them. I haven't beat all of them, but I've played all of them. I know we all enjoy them to some extent as well. But there was plenty of people that were anticipating the game just because it was the next Final Fantasy game. But there was also a ton of people that had absolutely no idea what it was until they saw the cutting-edge graphics and the cutting-edge gameplay upon the release of this new console generation, that they wanted it because it was the latest and greatest and best-looking thing in video games, not because it was a JRPG or because it was Final Fantasy. And if things had come before it that had already sort of gotten people excited about the 32-bit era on PlayStation, then it wouldn't have been as new and fresh and exciting. It just would have been another good-looking 3D game, but it was an awesome-looking 3D game and one of the first, so it sort of was like a double whammy of pulling people in.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered that, the effect that the console had on the game itself within the context of gaming in that period. And I do think there's something to be said for the fact that PlayStation made possible a new vision of this Final Fantasy formula.
And I think that kind of touches perfectly onto what I kind of want to talk about next, which is like how Final Fantasy VII kind of influenced the whole, JRPG genre, or just gaming in general. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think it can be argued any other way than clearly it popularized JRPGs outside of Japan. I mean, albeit we were relatively young at the time, but I had no real knowledge of the genre almost at all previous to this, and soon after you got a relative flood of RPGs being developed for the West that, I, on top of loving the game, owe it such a great debt for introducing me to the genre and allowing me access to a lot more games in the genre that I've come to love. So I almost feel like if this game wasn't the success it was, my own gaming experience would be completely different. So that's an awesome aspect anyway. But I do feel like there's a couple of key ways in which its release, along with the release of some other games, really have played a huge role in the development of both its genre and gaming in general. One of the big ones is promotional campaigns. I don't have the most vivid memories of gaming advertisements previous to that. I know I obviously saw them. I'm sure we all did. And, we saw the Sonic ads. We saw whatever they were. But I do vividly remember the Final Fantasy ads. And I know how much money, time, and energy was put into promoting Final Fantasy VII as this big, larger-than-life, game-changing experience that everyone needed to be part of. That was going to be the talk of the town. That was going to be something you wouldn't want to miss. And it sort of laid the template for a big tentpole release of a big blockbuster game going forward. Like previous to that, I don't remember seeing posters for games like that in game stores, seeing ads for it in magazines, seeing multiple commercials on popular television shows. Like gaming didn't really permeate popular culture in my eyes as much until I saw that. Then all of a sudden it was like every big budget game that came after it was everywhere. Like game developers realized that in order to get a game to reach those heights, you had to spend the money and time and treat it like it was almost like a big budget movie. So I thought that was one of the ways. Another way that Justin just referenced that I know you guys will obviously have something to say about is I think Aeris's death on every list of like most emotional gaming sequences, if it isn't number one, it's in the top 3. Like I think even if that scene didn't mean a whole lot to you personally, you acknowledge its importance in gaming history. And I think that absolutely laid the template, as Steve mentioned, in many ways for things that came after, not just in RPGs, but in games feeling like they needed this big twist, surprise, upending moment that would have people talking the way they did about that, because that became one of the few things in gaming, definitely then, but even so now, that like people still go out of their way to avoid spoiling to people. I mean, there's people that play like Final Fantasy VII on Twitch who say, this is my first playthrough, come watch me play, and everyone's like, I wonder if they're going to experience that without knowing about it. I can't wait to see what their reaction is. I mean, how many
The fact that 90% of people don't respect spoiling people's experiences of movies or whatnot, but like the overwhelming majority of gamers will respect the first playthrough of a Final Fantasy VII is something.
Yeah, I feel like if you can't do that, then you hold nothing in gaming sacred. Like if you're willing,
That's true.
If you're willing to spoil that for someone, then you'd basically be willing to spoil, the gender of someone's child before they know. Like you have no limitations. I don't know, Justin, if because I know the games we've played since have been really pretty different, Justin, and Steve and I think have always gravitated a bit more towards the JRPG genre, and you've played a fair amount yourself, but in games you've played in other genres, have you seen any residual effects from Final Fantasy VII? Not even necessarily the gameplay, but just anything about the release or the reception of the game and how it's still kind of seen now.
I mean, it's still definitely a very nostalgic game for a lot of people. But I think talking about Final Fantasy VII, we have to look at too like the commercial success of it and how it led to even like the characters being like supplanted into other games. I mean, I think Cloud now is in like the newest Smash Brothers, if I'm correct in saying that. And he was also in Guys. And then you have all the spin-offs with Crisis Core and Dissidia and Dirge of Cerberus and all of those things. And I think in looking at that, I mean, people were obviously so like moved by the story, like and kind of what this game did for everyone, that people want to know more, and it's transcended like multiple platforms now. I think it's on, I mean, not just the PlayStation, but we have the PC, and now it just expanded into the mobile gaming. I think you can download Final Fantasy VII through like the iTunes store now, and then you have the re-release of it coming out for all the new people who haven't ever played it, and kind of redefining the game and just giving it a new sense of life.
Well, just know that no true purist will ever play Final Fantasy VII on the mobile device. Steve, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I have a lot of feelings which I'm not here going to express, but yeah, just to speak to the earlier conversation, there were so many things in Final Fantasy VII that were iconic. Even I do think Aeris is probably the most significant one of them, but I do think, for example, like a lot of villains in gaming are attempts to approximate Sephiroth today.
Without question.
And I mean, there's no denying, like, he was just a badass villain in just his sword, his aesthetic.
I still get chills every time I hear that music.
The way, his theme, the way he spoke, his sense of mystery. I mean, he's awesome. I think Sephiroth's amazing. I do think Cloud is somewhat iconic. I would say even more so than Cloud, actually, Cloud's sword, his like massive, giant, awesome Buster sword. That I think that is a lot of people try to approximate that in gaming.
And even playing off of that, couldn't agree more with both those points. I think just the cover of Cloud in front of the Shinra headquarters with his sword on his back was one of the first things to me that really stood out as like, I mean, it was the cover. It wasn't like a poster per se, but it so perfectly sort of encapsulates the game in a certain sense. It just from looking at that image, you get a sense of the type of scope and adventure that you're going to be on. It describes like somehow so well it captures the feeling of what you're really up against in that game and how exciting trying to topple Shinra, and then obviously it goes from there is. But like it's such a, before then I never really paid much attention to game covers or game art. I mean, I just kind of chose stuff on the basis of if I thought people told me it was cool or whatnot, but that was a cover I think if I would have seen, regardless, I would have said like, whoa, what is that?
Yeah, I think the cover, which I think the cover perfectly represents the game in as much as a cover can, and specifically in the sense it's awesome. So like, I mean, we're in the habit of using the word like awesome like every moment of every day, which is fine. Awesome in like the true sense of the word as awe-inspiring, full of awe, just revealing that grandiosity that lies in the depths of the game.
And that's why we went to great lengths to put the meteor in the eyes in our logo, as an homage to the cover and homage to like as an iconic symbol of of the strategy guide, what's on the strategy guide, what's on the cover.
We did manipulate it. It says Square Enix, please don't sue us yet. But no, I think we clearly. I mean, that's a perfect point, Justin. That speaks to how awesome just the imagery of that game is, and how much I still really enjoy it aesthetically and otherwise now. And I think it's also important to mention that from the cover down to the game itself, Final Fantasy VII really was a break from this understanding that RPGs had to be sword and sorcery, medieval fantasy things. I mean, the cover itself lets you know that the game takes place in a pseudo present day or futuristic setting in some ways. I mean, it's Cloud standing in front of this big industrial office building, not in front of a castle, not in front of...
I still think it's a type of fantasy, but it's definitely a completely different vision of fantasy than what came before it.
Oh, without question. And in replaying it, I actually think it's so much cooler to me now that the diversity of settings, Midgar in particular, are so far removed from so many of the sort of tried and true but ultimately boring fantasy medieval settings that it's really cool, like playing this RPG, this fantastical adventure in this very gritty, very dirty, very like urban world that doesn't really... I mean, you're walking in, there's people like drinking beer and watching television, but you're also equipping materia to cast catastrophic spells. It's a really weird juxtaposition, but somehow it actually works and is really cool. Like it makes the game feel so different from a lot of other things that came before, and even some things that came after. And it just, because I'll always love a good old fashioned Knights and Wizards and Dragons, RPG. I love that stuff, and I think it's an important aspect of the genre. But Final Fantasy VII did really break from that, and I'm glad that it did, because it created a whole nother sort of means by which to approach this whole genre. So it's actually kind of disappointing, guys, because I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface of Final Fantasy VII, even though we're quite a bit in. And there's plenty more I could say, but I guess it's really sort of maybe up to whether or not people want to hear more. I know just in chit-chatting about the game ourselves, we haven't even scratched the surface of like the ins and outs of the story, the materia system, the remake, for God's sakes. I mean, I could talk for a whole episode just about my near orgasmic reaction to the remake announcement. But
yeah, I mean, the remake is an interesting question. That'll deserve a particular discussion on how the battle gameplay is going to work out and feel for those who experience Final Fantasy VII in its original form. Having said that, I could also spend an entire episode just discussing how much I personally hate Yuffie as both a character and well, let's just leave it at that.
And perhaps the greatest mystery of all, which is, did I really perfect Final Fantasy VII, or is that all just a lie? And maybe we can reveal that in a future episode. But
well, Twitter responders are already tweeting in, and the answer is no. So no, you've never perfected the game. You've never beaten it.
We will leave one question for the next episode, and that's, what particular summon did Justin miss during his Final Fantasy playthroughs?
Hardest one to miss in the entire game, because it's literally just laying right in front of you. But to wrap this one up, guys, thank you again for listening so much. We want to end each episode, as we have been doing, with some shout-outs. There's quite a number, at least these last 2 weeks, because people have been so gracious to us so far. I know these guys can attest to the fact that every time I've even seen we've gotten some new listeners, I've sort of jumped for joy. It's been so much fun doing this with you two, but knowing that anyone else has actually been listening and caring does kind of make it even more fun. So thank you in general, first of all, as a blanket statement to anyone who's listened, shared, watched, whatever you've done. It really means a lot to all of us. In specific terms, I want to thank very heartily Andreas from Studio Hoku. He is doing some art for us that will be revealed or released very soon. I shouted out to a previous artist last episode. I want to shout out to Andreas now. He's been a joy to work with. His stuff can be found at Studio Hoku. That's studiohoku.tumblr.com. He's an awesome artist. It's been fun working with him. He's doing some, I'd describe as like a Streets of Rage character select type art style with each of us that I think came out great. Hopefully you guys will like it when you see it. He just is an awesome guy. Get in touch with him if you want maybe similar work done or just want to discuss maybe his work with him. Really cool. So thanks, Andreas. Hope you're listening. You're the man. As I did last time, I want to give a hearty thank you to Reddit/r/Final Fantasy and /r/EverQuest. Both were cool enough to let us promote our podcast there. And I very much understand that people self-promoting on Reddit can be very annoying. So I was very careful to tread lightly in doing it. Let them know that if they didn't think it was appropriate to be shared there, by all means take it down. But I did think that people there might enjoy our content. It was really cool that they gave us feedback. listened to it, allowed it to be upvoted. So thank you guys all so much. If any of you are listening, I really appreciate it, and I might continue posting it there if you'll let me. So thank you guys. Thirdly, I want to thank Mike for the last episode. I don't want to speak for you guys, but I had fun talking to Mike. I don't know if you guys did, but
I personally never have fun talking to Mike, but
I thought he kind of like hogged the spotlight, but no, I'm just kidding. He was a pleasure to have, and hope to have him back on a couple of other episodes to talk with us about some excellent content.
yeah, Mike's overlap with us gaming wise is a bit more in the online spectrum. So for stuff that deals with like online PC type stuff, he might be a good person to have back, but he's never been quite as into a lot of the console stuff as we have. So we want to get him back on here. You guys seem to enjoy his perspective, but it'll be a matter of finding out stuff we can all kind of see eye to eye on. Fourth, thank you to everyone that's actually checked out our stuff on YouTube as well. I know YouTube isn't necessarily the most conducive medium for podcasting, but we do want to put our stuff there. And until we get 100 subs, we can't have a dedicated YouTube name. So if you're gracious enough or willing, please sub to us on YouTube, only if you think we deserve it. We're not going to ask for pity and just beg you to create goofy accounts on YouTube and sub to us. But if you think we deserve it, please go to our social media, find our YouTube site, and sub to us there, because getting youtube.com/The Limit Breakers or The Limit Breakers Pod would be kind of a cool thing, and it'd help us out a lot. So,
but if that vibe doesn't work for you, Justin has agreed to sell his body for YouTube subs.
how many subs do you think his body's worth per se?
I mean, at least like
You can't answer.
Oh.
Either way, just sub to us on there. It's been exciting to see the progress thus far, but it would be really awesome to hit that 100. Awesome thank you to another gaming podcast, which is Steven, Dustin, and Chance. I've listened to your guys' individual YouTube channels for a long time. Got into Dustin's first because he's maybe the only other person on earth that loves stouts, scotch, and JRPGs and 90s alternative as much as I do. I didn't actually think that combination was found anywhere else in the world, but apparently it is. Those guys are cool. They have a podcast together called Another Gaming Podcast. It's on YouTube and iTunes. If you like us, I think you'll like their stuff because they kind of have similar perspectives, kind of go about it the same way. So I know Steven acknowledged us on Facebook. It was really cool of him. Hope you've had a chance to check us out. We'll continue checking your guys' stuff out, and maybe if we ever achieve our lofty goals, maybe we'll do something with you guys one day. And then finally, if you guys want to hear more about Final Fantasy VII, I know we love the game so much. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we're scheduling specific episodes in advance. So we're always kind of keen to see what you guys want, and then also kind of what we want on any given week. We try to give you guys some notice just the week leading up to what we're going to be doing and when to expect it. But for now, we're kind of just flying by the seat of our pants. So let us know what you thought about this. Let us know what you're thinking in general. We'd love to do more, I think, but I guess it depends on, what you guys want also. So anything else to add before we wrap up this wondrous recording?
Yep. I want to thank both of you guys, Cam and Justin. It's not every day someone gets to talk about some of the more magical, enjoyable hobbies of their lives, and gets to do it with an audience. So it's pretty damn cool.
And I would like to say that I think that's the only nice thing Steve's ever said to either of us.
And will be the only nice thing from here on out.
But seriously, it's been great, doing this podcast with the two of you. And then, of course, I'd like to give a shout out to a local video game store. It's called Regen. It's one of the reasons that we're able to play some of these nostalgic games that we love and cherish so much, and really just kind of the whole retro video game store franchise as a whole. I'd like to just give a shout out to anybody who's in that business. And then the last thing is, if you guys want another episode on a particular subject, you guys will have to collect all of the 1/12 soldiers in order to unlock that episode. And if you don't share this episode, I will come to your house and personally cast media rain upon you.
Well, you don't cast that. It's a limit break. But anyway, the end of episode 2, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Regen, by the way, is located in White Marsh Mall here in Maryland. They're actually going to remain in the mall, but they are moving locations in the mall. So if you go in like us and are looking for them and they're gone, they are still in the mall. They're just moving locations. Thank you guys so much for listening. For Cameron, Justin, and Steven, this is the Limit Breakers episode 2. We'll talk to you next time.